Today is our fifth lecture in this short lecture series, and today we are talking about the complete aspects of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, how Russia, how the West looked at this full-scale invasion, what they got right, what they got wrong, and how it's developed since then in its various components. If we look on the second slide, there's a great short compilation video of how every, you name it, all believed, all were absolutely confident that they would defeat Ukraine in a matter of days. And of course, this was a consequence of their own mythology and stereotypes about Ukraine. You will be difficult to find a real expert on Ukraine anywhere in Russia, including in Moscow. I mean, I've said this on more occasions that you'll find more experts on Ukraine in Poland and in Western Europe and North America, but in Russia, you won't get them. They think they understand Ukraine, and they continue to blurb and talk ridiculous nonsense about Ukraine, but they approach this invasion on the assumption that Ukraine is a fake country, that most Ukrainians are little Russians who will greet them as liberators, that Zelensky is just in power with a bunch of Nazis, a small bunch of Nazis, propped up by the CIA. As soon as the invasion happens, they'll run away to the West with bags of money, and these little Russians will greet the Russian soldiers with bread and salt. Of course, this is fantasy land, but this is the fantasy land that Russia believed in, and the entire Russian leadership believed in. It's understandable why they believed it, because they had these stereotypes and myths about Ukraine and Ukrainians. What is less understandable is the degree to which this was also the same viewpoint in the West. Why did practically every Western government, Ministry of Defense, so-called experts also believe that the Russian army was really powerful and it was going to defeat Ukraine quickly? Why was that the commonly held view in the West as well? There have been some good studies about this lack of knowledge. I mean, it's a product of many factors, which is too many to discuss here. But of course, Russophilism in Western academia is a factor, and in think tanks. But also the fact that there was a kind of a lack of knowledge about the Russian army. Why was there a conviction in the West that the Russian army had reformed and it was the second best in the world, as Moscow claimed? Why was it ignored that if you have Russia as a mafia state, if corruption is so pervasive in Russia, why would there be the case that the Russian army and the security services would not be corrupted as well? Why would they be absent from that corruption but when they're just part of the entire system? And this was absolutely incredible that this was missed, that this Russian army was so incompetent, so lack of reform, so Soviet, and so corrupted, that obviously it wasn't the second best in the world. And it's been shown to be the second best in Ukraine. In fact, that has worked to Ukraine's advantage. But this is a great little compilation of how journalists on Russian TV, political pundits and otherwise, were convinced that of this Russian superiority. And in fact, Russian soldiers who were slated to liberate, in inverted commas, Kiev, actually carried with them parade uniforms. The plan was to hold a victory parade along Kiev's main thoroughfare, the Khreshchatyk, a bit like Hitler's in Paris in 1940. That obviously never happened because Kiev was never occupied by the Russians. And this misconception about the war, and hence it was called a special military operation, so something that would be very quickly over, persisted throughout most of 2022, and only after the Ukrainian rout of Russian forces in Kharkiv in September did Putin finally understand that things have to change, and then he organized a military mobilization in Russia, which led to the massive outflow of, depending on who you quote, 750,000 or 1 million Russians who fled abroad from Russia. So it only really changed in the latter part of 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine with 170,000 troops, which is a pittance for a country the size of Ukraine, and also a pittance for the size of Ukraine's army that the Russians were going to face. The Russians never expected to face the Ukrainian army. Many Russian soldiers were simply lied to. They were told they're going on military maneuvers. They didn't even know they're inside Ukraine. They were never told they were going to be involved in a war. And they were shocked and surprised that Ukrainians, these so-called little Russians, were actually shooting back at them. They never expected this. But 170,000 is simply insufficient to conquer a country the size of Ukraine. An attacking army needs at least 3 times as many troops as the defending army to succeed. And Ukraine at that stage had maybe 300, 400,000 military and security forces, so 170,000 would never have done it. And in comparison, you can look at Czechoslovakia in 1968, which the Russian-led Warsaw Pact invaded with 250,000 troops, so 70,000 more than Ukraine. And Czechoslovakia then was a country of only 10 million people. So this was obviously a product of simply false stereotypes and myths about Ukraine. There's one other factor that was at work in this failure at the beginning of the war, and that was that Russia's a dictatorship. It became a dictatorship after constitutional changes in 2020, and you're never going to take bad news to the Russian president. If you did, you would be served very dangerous poison tea, or you'd fall out of a window. So the only information brought to Putin was always good information, basically what he wanted to hear. And what he wanted to hear was that little Russians were waiting to be liberated from these damn Nazis. And that's what was brought to him from so-called Russian agents in Ukraine and the Russian intelligence service. So this is what was told to Putin, and then on this basis the so-called special military operation was undertaken. If we go to the third slide, this is all really described here. I think one of the kind of factors that's certainly come out of this is the complete lack of reform in the Russian military. This resembles a Soviet army, and because it's a reflection of the Russian society under Putin, a quarter of a century of re-Sovietization of Russia, re-Stalinization under Putin, an army which again reflects Russian society and the Russian economy, where the grunts, the basic soldiers, are treated like shit by their officers. They're treated like terribly. Not only when they're sent as cannon fodder to be murdered and killed by sometimes their own side and killed by the Ukrainians, but they're treated very badly in terms of their supplies that they're given, the lack of supplies, the poor quality of the medical care, food, and such like. This is a reflection of how Russians are treated by their own political system and their regime inside Russia, and it's reflected in the Russian Russian army. Very hierarchical, very inflexible in terms of how it's able to maneuver and act in warfare. Cowardly officers, and like the rest of Putin's Russia, very, very, very corrupt. I mean, some of the information is just astounding, where medical supplies are sent to soldiers from the late 1980s. It's Soviet vintage medical supplies. These are obviously useless now, or out-of-date food, or military equipment comes with parts that have been stolen, so it's useless to be used, that kind of army is facing a very different army, which is the Ukrainian, an army which has gone through reforms and has become de facto a NATO army since NATO-style army since 2014, which is far more flexible, far more supplied, where the soldiers are treated far better, where the officers have initiative and they can judge things themselves. Very different to the Russian, far more flexible. If we go now to slide 5, the other interesting factor here is that this is a war. This became a war and is a war between two very different societies, as we've discussed on previous lectures. It's a war between a Ukrainian society built on a horizontal level and a Russian society built on a vertical level. So the person at the bottom in Russian society has no standing, no rights, and no ability to defend him or herself. Orders are passed down and they have to be obeyed. There's no civil society. That's been crushed and destroyed in Russia. No real mass volunteer movement. And of course, there's no truthful information about the state of the war, high level of casualties in the Russian media. Ukraine's very different. Since 2014, you've had the development of a volunteer movement. Some of the best units in the 2014 conflict were actually the volunteer battalions, which were there were about 40 of them, and they were people who had maybe served on the Euromaidan revolution in so-called self-defense units, and then they had joined these volunteer battalions to fight the Russian army or pro-Russian proxies in the Donbass. So that volunteer movement continued, and it's still there to this day. This idea of charity, this idea of giving up your time, giving up money, giving up supplies. I mean, it's evident in Ukraine. It's evident in Ukraine, and it's evident also in the West, with many Western volunteer groups assisting Ukraine as well. But collections for the Ukrainian military come from both, of course, Western sources and Ukrainians giving their own money. That kind of development just simply does not exist in Russia. Ukrainians are more active as a volunteer movement and as volunteers as well, because they have agency. They are able to act on their own accord. They have initiative. They don't have to wait to be told what to do. Again, that's very different to Russia, where Russians have never become their own sort of, they've never become citizens with their own agency. Again, a development in Ukraine which has gone through 3 decades and 3 revolutions, and a civil society movement. So you have just in Ukraine, for example, a defense industrial sector which is very dispersed. Lots of small companies. These companies it's about 300, 400 private companies, together with the state companies, of course, who are developing new technologies, new military equipment for Ukrainian soldiers. You have Ukrainians who are in the profession of computer science or computer programming, who assist in cyber warfare, IT, which of course is very, very much required with drone warfare. So all of these are contributing to Ukraine's military. And these small defense companies are very important in keep giving Ukraine the edge over Russia in technology, because that kind of initiative, that kind of private development in the defense industrial sector simply does not exist in Russia. And just a final, I think, importance is Zelensky's leadership. There was a lot of criticism and concern about Zelensky at the beginning of or just before the full-scale invasion. Opinion polls showed that most Ukrainians didn't really have a great belief that Zelensky would be a good commander-in-chief if a war began. And they were wrong. Zelensky has actually shown himself to be a very good leader and very much in tune with public opinion, a very good orator, great speeches both in Ukraine and abroad. Certainly Ukrainian Winston Churchill, this is the way Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, calls him. And he has done things like visited Ukrainian troops on the front line, which of course Putin, being the coward he is, has never done. If we go to slide 6, this is kind of synthesize what we're talking about as to why Ukraine has been more successful than most people, most of these so-called experts and government officials in the West believed, and in terms of fighting Russia for the last 3 years. A country a third of the size of Russia in terms of population has held off this supposed, or no longer believed, second best army in the world. Ukrainians are fighting for their own land. I think that's always going to be a major difference between an aggressive imperialist power trying to steal your land, where there isn't really any kind of morale or kind of real kind of clear goals, except just destruction and theft. And in the Ukrainian case, this is defending Ukraine. Ukrainians see this as an existential war. If they are defeated, that's the end of Ukraine. It's going to lead to genocide of Ukrainians. So hence the importance of those goals are very much as a driving force for fighting for Ukraine. A lot of anger at Russia for the full-scale invasion, destruction of civilian property and energy infrastructure, and war crimes. Opinion polls show that absolute majority of Ukrainians now have a hatred for Russians, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Less than 5% today hold a positive view of the Russian people. Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion and war crimes has changed the manner in which eastern and southern Ukrainians, who were at one stage Russian-speaking, many have shifted to Ukrainian, has changed their views to now resemble those which always existed in Western Ukraine towards Russia and Russians. And that kind of negativity and hatred towards Russia and Russian people will continue for decades. This will not be overcome very quickly. This will be a long-term change. One of the reasons why that's happened is not only the actions of the Russian army in Ukraine, the raping and the pillaging. The United Nations has reported the raping has gone on from children as young as the age of 4 to women as old as 82. That's the age range. And it also includes men who are prisoners of war and other various crimes, which I won't talk about. But it's not only that, it's the fact that Ukrainians see that the majority of Russians support the war. They either support the war or they're passive. They're not countering the war. And I'll give you one example of that. I grew up in Britain, which in the Cold War had had the largest Ukrainian population in Western Europe. It wasn't big, but it was the largest. 30,000 Ukrainian diaspora in Britain. We had demonstrations and hunger strikes practically every weekend outside the Soviet embassy. If we weren't there, it would have been the Poles or the Estonians or the Lithuanians or us doing it together. There are 150,000 Russians living in England at this moment. You never see a single protest outside the Russian embassy. Not a single one. So when these so-called Western experts tell me this is Putin's war, not Russia's war, they're talking out of somewhere that they shouldn't be talking out of. It's simply not true, because not criticizing and just being apathetic is the same as actually supporting the war. And there are, of course, some courageous Russians, but sadly they're in a small minority. There's also just the question of Western military aid, which has been wrongly supplied in a drip fashion, but even relatively old Western military equipment is better than anything modern in Russia. So when Putin fired his so-called best missile at Kiev about 6 months ago, called the Kinjal, he said, nothing that NATO has can stop it. Well, a 20 to 30-year-old Patriot missile battery stopped this modern Russian missile. So I think this has had a tremendous impact on Russia's image. Countries around the world which used to import Russian weapons have stopped ordering them. India is the biggest example of this. India has relied on Russian weapons since the Soviet period, and is now looking elsewhere for weaponry. Russian weapons in Ukraine have been shown to be of very poor quality. And that's not a great image you want to project if you're looking for new markets for your products. On the other hand, the Ukrainians, if the war was to stop tomorrow, Ukraine would be in the top 5 military exporters in the world. Ukraine leads the world in drone and other types of production. Just a week ago, Ukraine launched the first ever non-human robotic military attack against Russian lines. These robotic ground and air drones, and I don't know how you call them, vehicles, robotic vehicles, were obviously operated by Ukrainians, but far back. Ukraine is in the lead in this kind of technology, and of course this because of the kind of structure of these small defense companies, and also because the war is a great place to experiment. I have already talked about how Ukraine has shifted to a more NATO-style army, so better quality officers, NCO system, middle-ranking officers who are on the ground fighting. They don't have to ring up Kiev and ask, "What do I do? Somebody's attacking me." They're able to use their own initiative and their own command, as it were, on the ground. The one downside is that, of course, Ukraine has a smaller pool of people to mobilize for its army than Russia has. Russia's population is 3 times bigger. And even though Russian casualties are far, far worse, something like 4 to 5 times higher than Ukrainians. So that is probably the one downside in all of this. If we look to the next slide, I reiterate what Boris Johnson, a charismatic supporter of Ukraine who was British Prime Minister at the time of the full-scale invasion, he has credited Zelensky with acting in the spirit of Winston Churchill. And I think there's no question this person who grew up in a Russian-speaking environment of Jewish background, secular but of Jewish background, has become the face of Ukrainian patriotism and Ukrainian resilience against Russia. And this is the next slide, slide 8, is just a quotation about the nature of this Russian army. This is no different to the Soviet army that moved through Central Eastern Europe and to Germany in 1944-45 and raped, pillaged, looted, and just murdered as it went along. Nothing has changed. The Russia of today is the same as the Stalinist army of the 1940s. And that is clearly seen in the barbaric nature of Russian attacks against civilians and of course, the raping and the looting. How about if we carry on? Number 10. As I've already mentioned, slide 10 shows the degree to which Russia as a mafia state has impacted upon the Russian army. Of course, this is a great thing for Ukraine. If the Russian army had actually been the second best army in the world, Ukraine probably would have been defeated. Or at the very least, it would have been a far bloodier and quicker and, maybe stretched out a bit, but Ukraine would have had far more difficulty in fighting back against Russia. The very fact that the state of the Russian army, the state of its military equipment was so bad, that was something in favor for Ukrainians. And this is a kind of list of some of the things that were supplied. I mean, old equipment, out-of-date food, out-of-date medical equipment, military equipment that simply doesn't work, or things are being stolen from it. Russia, as a so-called great power, was forced to go with a begging bowl to countries like North Korea and Iran to ask for stuff, ask for military kit. Russia had never developed until this full-scale war its own real drone industry, even though drones were something that Israel's had for 20 years prior to it. And Azerbaijan successfully used Israeli and Turkish drones in 2020 to defeat Armenia. That didn't have an impact on Russia. At the beginning of the war, the full-scale invasion, Russia asked Turkey to sell it or supply it with Bayraktar drones. Turkey refused. It only supplied them to Ukraine. And Russia had to go to Iran to get Shahid drones, which are far weaker in their quality than the Turkish drones. And this is the state of, the next slide shows the state of the Russian army. The mind-boggling statistics of nearly 10,000 Russian tanks gone, and the casualty rates are astronomical. Now over 700,000 Russian casualties, killed and wounded. But although that sounds, oh, well, maybe the wounded survive. No, in the Russian case, most of the wounded die. So when we talk about Russian casualties, we should talk about the fact that these are all basically dead. And in the Ukraine army, in the NATO Western army, if you're wounded on the battlefield, you're patched up very quickly because you only have about a 2-hour window before you die from loss of blood or something else. You're patched up and you're evacuated to a rear military hospital where greater work is done to make sure you survive. So most wounded in the Ukrainian case and in the NATO army survive. In the Russian case, the wounded are left to die in the battlefield, or they're actually shot by their own side. There are many videos on Twitter where Russian soldiers are actually shot by their own people when they're wounded, so that they won't fall into Ukrainian hands. The importance about the loss of so much equipment is that Russia is now dipping into Soviet stocks. So these stocks were of equipment were inherited from the Soviet Union. Presumably they would have been used if there was a future war with NATO. Russia is really severely intruding into these stocks of Soviet equipment, and the prediction is that by the end of 2025, Russia will have run out of this Soviet reserve military equipment. What it's producing is simply not enough each month to cover what is lost on the battlefield. You can find on Twitter every day countless videos of Ukrainians destroying Russian military convoys, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles. So Russia will be in crisis in terms of its military capabilities by the end of next year, which is, again, is going to be a factor in all of these discussions about whether Ukraine should sign a peace agreement or not. If, as we now hear, the Trump administration will be willing to continue supplying military equipment and maybe even increasing it compared to the Biden administration, if Putin doesn't play ball in negotiations, then Ukraine would have a far bigger advantage over Russia, particularly as 2025 goes on. The daily average losses for Russian soldiers has been creeping up in the last 6 months because of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk region. Putin has demanded that the Ukrainians be expelled from the region very quickly. And the major reason for that is the Trump administration coming into power in next month. Putin will obviously never sign a peace deal with Ukraine if Ukraine continues to control some of Russian territory, because then a frozen conflict line would include Russian territory under Ukraine. So Putin has ordered, irrespective of the rate of casualties, for Kursk to be brought back under Russian control, and that's where the North Korean troops are fighting and dying in huge numbers as well. Zelensky said just recently that already about 3,000 North Koreans have been killed out of the 10,000 that were sent. But in the last few months, the casualty rate has increased for Russians to 2,000 and 2,200 every day. Again, it's difficult to see how long this can continue, because the number of people who are mobilized each month has to be higher than the rate of casualties each month. And that's no longer the case in Russia. The Russians who are mobilized or volunteered each month simply do not cover the rate of casualties. If we're talking about 2,000 a day, we're talking 60,000 a month. I mean, that's simply astronomical. So again, that could be another area potentially of a threat to Russian military capabilities in 2025. Another interesting factor, well, there's probably two interesting factors here, what we've seen with the Russian army, is that firstly, it's not been able to dominate the skies in the war. In every war, who controls the skies usually wins. We saw that in the Gulf War, and the Americans and the coalition forces control the skies. Saddam Hussein was toast. The prediction of so-called Western experts was that the Russians would very quickly control the skies over Ukraine, and they yet they've never done that. In the last 3 years, the Russians have never been able to control the skies over Ukraine. So that is one of the reasons why the Russian army has not done too well. A second factor is what we've noticed is the Russian army is simply incapable of launching big military offenses. They haven't really done that. They weren't successful in 2022, and the way they operate now is usually in small groups of people. It's not in large military formations. What Western armies would call combined arms operation, where you have the Air Force, tanks and armored personnel carriers, infantry, and artillery all working together as one, as it were, combined unit. Russians have never been successful at doing that. At the beginning of the war, Ukraine was successful in liberating and pushing the Russians out of the Kiev region. Russians were pushed out by the end of March 2022. Kharkiv in September 2022 was liberated, and the Russians have kept trying to get back into Kharkiv and have always been pushed out. Kherson was liberated in November of 22, and the Russians failed to, as it were, break through from Kherson to Mykolaiv to Odessa along the south coast. That was the objective, to cut Ukraine off from the sea, and in fact that's never happened. In fact, the alternative has happened. Ukraine has pushed the Black Sea Fleet out of the Crimea, because Ukraine has destroyed a third of the Black Sea Fleet. So a country without a navy which is because the ships were all stolen by Russia, a country without a navy has actually overcome a country with a navy. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has moved to the northern Caucasus port of Novorossiysk. So hence, this is the joke. This slide is about when the Russian mercenary group, the so-called the Wagner group, attempted it's difficult to call it a coup, some kind of uprising in June of 2023, and that led to the joke that the Russian army is not even good enough to fight the Wagner mercenaries, because these troops that launched this, whatever you want to call it, uprising, coup, whatever, were not really opposed by any of the Russian army, and they got to about 150 miles, 200 kilometers from Moscow, but then for some reason stopped. Let's look at the consequences from slide 15 of the war. One of the consequences of this is going to be that in every town, village, and city of Ukraine, wherever there's a cemetery, there will be an area of that cemetery where Ukrainian soldiers are buried. I know this from Western Ukraine, because in the city of Sambir, which is kind of 80 kilometers west of Lviv, that's my father's home region, so I know the cemetery there, and I can see the plot of the Ukrainians who were killed after 2014 and the ever-growing plot of soldiers killed after 2022. There's a very large area in the cemetery in Lviv as well devoted to this, but this is going to be everywhere in Ukraine. I also, prior to the full-scale invasion, visited Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, which also had a very large section in its military cemetery devoted to the 2014 invasion. What this means is that Ukrainians will have places to commemorate, to hold commemorations, to hold protests, to not forget what has happened in this war, and that is why it's another reason why I say that it'll take decades for Ukrainians to overcome their hatred of Russia and Russians, because that memory will linger on. As it shows here, nearly 80% of Ukrainians, so 4/5 of Ukrainians, know somebody who's been wounded or killed in these two invasions, 2014, 2022. And as you'll see on this slide, this is true throughout the country. The orange parts of these poles, as it were, are the numbers of the people, of Ukrainians who do know somebody who's been killed or wounded. So if we look at the western part, this goes from sort of 69 to 80% in various categories. and that's the Western Ukraine. In Eastern Ukraine, it's not that much different, 52 to 70% there as well, because the Ukrainian army attracts people from throughout the country. And in fact, you will have quite a few Russian speakers from Eastern Ukraine who are even angrier, more angrier than Western Ukrainians maybe, serving in the Ukrainian army. One of the factors which Russia, besides when Putin and the Kremlin launched their full-scale invasion, they miscalculated on two areas. One I've already talked about, which is that they miscalculated over Ukrainians. They believed, or as Americans say, they drank their own Kool-Aid. They really believed that Ukrainians would be little Russians and they would greet them as liberators. That didn't happen. They also miscalculated because they expected the West to not really do anything. And this is a product of the fact the West didn't do anything in 2014 and did even less in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia and annexed two of its territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In 2014, the Western response to Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea was pathetic. There's no other way to describe it. The sanctions were a joke. They were only really, these sanctions were only really introduced after the shooting down of MH17, the civilian airliner, with the killing of 300 passengers and crew in July of 2014. And most Western countries continued business as usual with Moscow after that. Germany continued to build Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. This sent signals to Moscow that if they launched the full-scale invasion, they would again get a little slap on the wrist, and maybe a few sanctions, but life would continue. It would be business as usual, would continue. They were wrong on this. This was a red line crossed. It was a very different world to 2014. Many things had moved on. You could, for example, compare the Western reaction to the poisoning or attempted poisoning of Skripal in England in 2018 and the actual poisoning of Litvinenko in London in 2006. After the poisoning of and the death of Litvinenko, very few Russian diplomats were expelled, sadly. And the British government took 10 years to finally point the finger at Putin. 10 years. In 2018, huge numbers, something like over 300 diplomats were expelled because of that attempted poisoning of Skripal in England, including over 150 from the US. So the world had moved on, but in the Kremlin, they hadn't quite got that. So they expected a very weak response, and that did not happen. The West imposed for the first time Iranian-style really tough sanctions on Russia. Yes, they haven't been always completely successful, but they imposed those sanctions. The European Union, the United States, Canada imposed those. The West also began providing two things to Ukraine, and we shouldn't lose sight of both because they're both as important as each other. Firstly, economic and financial support to the Ukrainian government, which was important in maintaining the government afloat, payment of pensions, social security, state officials, teachers, etc. Because the Ukrainian budget obviously went down a lot. The collection of revenues went down because in 2022, as a response to the war, the invasion, Ukraine's economy sank by a third. And of course, the second part is the military support from European NATO members and from the United States and Canada. Some countries supplied more than others. That has changed over time. The dynamics have changed. The European Union has given the greatest amount of financial support to Ukraine, financial economic support. the United States has given the greatest amount of military support. In Europe, at the beginning, it was the British and the Polish military support was the greatest, and now more recently, Germany has become probably in second place in terms of its military support to Ukraine, particularly air defense, which is very important in the Ukraine case. And here Zelensky has played a great role in lobbying for that military support to continue and to be sent along, and complaining about sometimes how slow it is. Russia never expected, of course, the reaction of Finland and Sweden, which two very long-standing neutral countries who applied to join NATO in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So actually, Russia's border with NATO tripled or doubled as a consequence of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Some countries began to talk about the need to really massively expand their military budget. Poland in particular has been talking about that. It may have, in the next few years, the biggest army in Europe. But with the incoming Trump administration talking about now increasing the minimum defense spending from 2 to 3% of GDP, then that's going to be something across the board in Europe that many countries are going to have to begin thinking about. So all of these factors have impacted. Ukraine and Moldova receive candidate status from the EU. That means they're on the path to eventually join the European Union. The biggest letdown is probably the question of NATO membership. The number of countries out of 32 NATO members who support Ukraine joining has grown, and even France, which traditionally was against, is now supporting Ukraine joining. But there are two main obstacles to Ukraine joining NATO, and that's Germany and the United States. United States, since 2008, President Bush was the last US president to support Ukraine joining NATO. Both Obama and Biden, Democrats, and Trump, Republican, have opposed Ukraine joining NATO. In Germany, every German chancellor, irrespective of political persuasion, has opposed Ukraine joining. Smaller countries like Slovakia and Hungary also opposed, but I don't think they are crucial in this. The big players, Germany and America, are the crucial countries in this question. But this question of NATO membership is important, will become important, especially in 2025, over discussions in the so-called peace agreement that the Trump administration wants to propose. Because I believe that most Ukrainians might be favorable towards a peace agreement that freezes the current conflict line, even though it leaves 18 to 20% of Ukrainian territory in Russian hands, but only if free Ukraine is allowed to join NATO. So the model here would be Western and Eastern Germany. Western Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955 when Eastern Germany was still occupied by the Soviet Union. And so that would be the kind of scenario, but as of today, the Trump administration is not supporting Ukraine's NATO membership. But that could, of course, could change. If we go to slide 17, another outcome of this full-scale invasion is that Russia has lost its influence. It's losing its influence around the world anyway, but inside Ukraine, its soft power has collapsed. Russia will no longer have that influence in Ukraine, which it believed and maybe it had previously. Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president from 2014 to 2019, already went against that and reduced that Russian soft power influence in the media in particular, and in books and education. President Zelensky, who came into power in 2019, has continued that with investigations of the Russian Orthodox Church the banning of 12 pro-Russian political parties after the full-scale invasion, and also the closing down of 5 television channels which were controlled by pro-Russian forces. So, and when you look at opinion polls today, you can see that that pro-Russian sentiment has simply evaporated. It simply doesn't exist anymore. And what is happening inside Ukraine is a reflection of what's happening outside Ukraine. Russia has lost influence in, for example, the South Caucasus. Armenia, which was traditionally pro-Russian, is no longer really interested in cooperating with Russia. Russia was unable to prevent Azerbaijan defeating Armenia in the 2020 Second Karabakh War, even though there were Russian peacekeepers on the ground for some of that time. They didn't intervene. Russia has lost its influence in Syria with the overthrow of the Assad regime. Russia's going to lose a naval port, which it's had since 1971, when it was the Soviet Union, and a military base, an airfield, an air base inside Syria as well. And Russia's already had lost its ability to try to engineer developments inside Libya. So even outside, Russia as a great power is losing influence. We've already talked about how Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. So the full-scale invasion has actually backfired on the spread of Russian influence. The one difference that you could argue counter to that argument would be Georgia, where pro-Russian regime continues to remain in power, but we wonder, with the mass protests every day, we wonder for how long they are able to hang on, as it were. This is a summary of how Russia has lost its influence, or is losing its influence. The Russia of today is now de facto China's younger brother. It might call itself a great power, but China's in the driving seat, not Russia. China was always the rising power, Russia the declining power, and Russia is totally dependent now on Iranian weapons, North Korean weapons, and in particular Chinese imports. If China was to end its trade, particularly of so-called dual-use goods, to Russia, the Russian military would no longer be able to fight in Ukraine. So Russia is heavily dependent. Russian oil, which previously was bought by Europe, is now primarily bought by India and China at discounted prices. So Russia is dependent on those two countries for its oil sales as well. I've already mentioned the South Caucasus. Countries in what Russia likes to see as its sphere of influence in Eurasia, the former Soviet Union, are drifting away. Ukraine and Moldova are moving or joining the European Union. Armenia is breaking with Russia. Azerbaijan was never part of the Russian sphere of influence. But Central Asia, which Russia has always seen as its kind of pro-Russian underbelly, a bit like the United States used to look at Central and Latin America, that is now increasingly becoming an area where Chinese influence is growing, as opposed to Russia. China offers not only military support, but also financial support. Russia doesn't have the financial means to support these countries. Yes, it provides military equipment, but as we've seen, that military equipment is simply of very poor quality. What's interesting, that at all the votes at the United Nations dealing with Crimea, the full-scale invasion, and condemning Russia's territorial annexation of Ukraine territory, only one former Soviet republic, so 1 out of 15, Belarus, votes alongside Russia. Only one. The other republics, whether it's Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, even Georgia, usually abstains. It's only Belarus that actually ticks the box. So at the United Nations, when Russia is dealing with these kinds of votes on these resolutions condemning Russia, only 5 countries in the entire world back Russia usually. And that's Belarus. It used to be Saddam Assad, Syria. That's no longer the case. Nicaragua, North Korea, and that's it. Even Iran abstains for most of the time, because the problem with that Iran and China have is that these are countries that are very fearful about their own territorial integrity, and so they have to make the pretense that, well, we support Ukraine's territorial integrity. They obviously don't, because you're supporting Russia, but that's the pretense they make. The image of Russia as a great power, losing Syria, being defeated in Libya, and then going with a cap in hand for military equipment and even artillery shells to North Korea and Iran, obviously is going to impact on Russia's image around the world. This is the first time in history that, as we see on slide 19, the first time in history that a nuclear weapons country, Russia, its leaders have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. Of course, Russia is not a member of the ICC, but nevertheless, 6 leading Russians have been indicted. Putin was one of the first in March of 23. I'm surprised even more have not been indicted, because Russia continues to commit so many war crimes, including the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. But nevertheless, 2 senior Russian generals and various officials plus Putin have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. What that translates into is that it limits the countries to which Putin can visit, because a country that signed up to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court has a duty to arrest a person if that coming on their territory, if that person has been criminally charged. So that limits Putin to visit countries that are not signatures to the Rome Statute. Coming to the end now, we have to conclude that, and of course Russians will never accept this, that Russia's great power image is in decline. China is now the rising power. This is what the Republicans are concerned about in the United States, and what the new Trump administration is concerned about as well. Their hope is that they can, as they call it, park Russia and focus on the main threat, which is China. By parking Russia, it'll be a bit more complicated than I think they realize, but certainly if they want to do that, they'll have to realize that it won't be that easy to break this axis of evil that exists between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. These countries are tied at the hip. Certainly the Trump administration will go after Iran. I'm convinced that Trump will give the green light to Israel, maybe to Turkey as well, to move against Iran in a more forceful way. That would maybe lead to regime change in Iran, and that would be good for Ukraine, because Iran would be unable to continue supporting Russia militarily. Iran has already lost a big client state, Syria, which it used as a base for its terrorist support for various proxy groups in the greater Middle East. But as I've already mentioned, Russia is now de facto China's younger brother. And let's recall, which many people forget, that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China had very bad relations. In fact, in 1969, the Soviet Union and China went to war briefly. So that kind of disquiet amongst Russian nationalists about China is very deep, particularly because large parts of eastern Siberia were occupied by the Russian Empire and stolen from China, and China's never forgotten that. So if we use Putin's language about historical lands wrongly included in states, well, these are historically Chinese lands wrongly included in the Russian state. Within Russia has always demanded that the US recognize this former Soviet space, excluding the Baltic states, as its exclusive sphere of influence. Well, that's gone. That's practically gone. There's only really Belarus left. Armenia is kind of a dissident member. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is very angry that Russia didn't come to its defense during its recent wars with Azerbaijan. And Armenia is pulling out of the Russian-led CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So Armenia's really gone. If only Belarus is really left, that means that Lukashenko is totally dependent on Putin. So if Russia was to be militarily defeated, then Lukashenko would be removed at the same time as Putin would lose power. Russian military equipment. Russia had two main exports prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine: energy and military equipment. Both of those are now practically gone. Russian energy is sold at discounted prices to India and China, but no longer to what was its biggest market since the Soviet period, since the 1970s, to Europe. Very few countries, maybe except some poorer countries in Africa, want to continue buying Russian military equipment. So quite a few canceled foreign contracts. Obviously, nobody believes anymore that Russia has the second best army in the world. So this photograph shows Ukrainians liberating a town in the Kharkiv region and removing Russian flags. 2025 will be a decisive year in this war. It'll be a decisive year because of the incoming Trump administration, because of pressures inside Ukraine and Russia. In Ukraine, the biggest problem, the only real main problem, is question of mobilization of people, of men, primarily for the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian economy, ironically, is doing far better than the Russian economy here. In the case of Russia, the pressures internally are the very high casualty rates, which are not sustainable, the coming to the end of being able to draw upon Soviet military equipment reserves, and thirdly, the very poor state of Russia's economy and financial reserves, which are experts believe will be going into crisis mode in 2025. So all of these factors together will produce a fascinating outcome, probably decisive outcome for this war in 2025. Certainly, the way we currently see the Trump so-called peace plan, and when I say peace plan, I say that in inverted commas. When we see that, this is more favorable to Ukraine in many ways than it is to Russia. And I think we should end on this note as we move into 2025 and as we approach the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion, because much of the Western discussion about this really focuses on how Ukraine would be the loser, not Russia. And I think that's mistaken. Yes, Ukraine would potentially have to forego, not legally, but forego temporarily control over 18 or 20% of its territory occupied by Russia. But a frozen conflict line, as of today, would benefit Ukraine in terms of being able to rebuild the country, people returning home from Western Europe, and to rebuild Ukraine's military and economy, to end that suffering of civilians who are bombarded every day, children being able to go back to school normally. In the Russian case, a freezing of the conflict line as of today would give Putin none of the objectives he initially sought in the war. And those objectives were to destroy the Ukrainian state, to transform Ukrainians back into some kind of little Russians, so make Ukraine into a kind of a Belarusian-style puppet state, and particularly to take control of what these Russian nationalists call Russian cities like Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv. Russia has not achieved any of those goals. Russia has annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, but doesn't control fully any of those 4. And Russia is demanding for it to attend these peace talks that Ukraine acknowledge and give up control of all of those 4 areas, 4 oblasts, 4 regions, which Ukraine would never do. So all of these factors, coupled with also the one that Ukraine continues to control Russian territory, leads me to believe that Putin will never agree to the kind of proposals being made by the Trump administration, and which has already said it will continue to supply arms to Ukraine and wants to put Ukraine in a better position to negotiate from a position of strength, and therefore might actually increase military support for Ukraine. So I think 2025 will be decisive for this war, and it could be one, and we hope and pray it will be one, where Ukraine will be victorious. Certainly, I think at least one thing will be clearer with the Trump administration than with the Biden administration. The Biden administration never said what its goals were in the war. The Biden administration never said ever that its goal was Russia's military defeat. The Biden administration gave Ukraine sufficient weapons for it not to be defeated, but not sufficient for it to be victorious. That could possibly change in 2025. We shall see how it progresses, but we should not be we should not look at this in such a pessimistic way as many of the commentators do when talking about the incoming Trump administration. Thank you very much.